Hey number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're back with Vanity Fair. Now there is a video that I promised you that I would have reacted to, and it's this video here which is titled Vampire Expert Reviews Vampires in Movies and TV. I only watched at the very beginning, and it appeared, which is something that has already happened on this channel specifically, that this person here is a doctor. There we go, Dr. Laura Westengard. She's a professor, and therefore you would expect, wow, this is great. So I'm going to sit down and listen to a lecture. She's going to explain to me vampires with a deep understanding, because that's what she does. It did appear, I might be wrong, ready to say it if that's the case, but it did appear that this was once again, as it happened already on Vanity Fair, and I noticed on this video here with another professor, that instead what they were doing is that they were taking an opportunity to push modern politics. If that's not the case, fantastic.
In normative society, racist and imperialist implications, identity politics, coming to political action, binary gender, capitalist, gay, racial hierarchies, queer sexuality, queer relationship, gender and sexuality, climate change. There's a homophobic undertone, gender, than it does around sexuality. Not just homoerotic, but homoerotic, sexualized perversity, vampire identity.
Not everything is about sex and sexuality. I think what I would like to do today is to watch this, maybe see some interesting information and sort of divide it from what appears to be a modernist and mostly politically driven interpretation of facts, which I personally disagree with. So let's go and let's check it out.
I'm Dr. Laura Westengard, and I'm a professor of English, Gothic literature, and gender and sexuality.
So that's already my first thing. So she is a professor of gender and sexuality. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's a topic, great. We can talk about anything. You know me, when it comes to these things. I'm very much pro freedom of speech, pro share your mind. But if you're a professor of gender and sexuality, and then you're going to talk about vampires today, I have a feeling you're going to project some of those gender studies in there. Is it the case? Let's see.
My PhD focusing on Gothic themes and metaphors, but also how Gothic metaphors come through into contemporary culture. Today,
Okay, so once again, the PhD sounds very interesting, so maybe there will be something I can learn today and be great. But the fact that she's saying how those are connected, or whatever word she used, to contemporary, it sounds very similar to what happened with the previous professor that I had to debunk with my team because shared a lot of nonsense, because it was a professor of mythology for the modern era, which of course in that case meant that everything was racist, everything was transphobic, homophobic, and I thought it was really a shame, because I thought I could learn a thing or two, and instead a lot of the history was wrong, his Greek was wrong, it was really, really bad. Of course, with that professor it was a little easier for me to tackle, mostly because he talked about history, and history is what we do here, and civilization and language. Now with her, she's talking specifically about vampires. Now I'm familiar with the ancient sources. I believe one of the first mentions of vampires is Babylonian tales, and then there are also mentions in ancient Rome. So I'm familiar with those. I'm familiar with how the concept of vampirism and vampires and mythology continued and evolved throughout the Middle Ages, how Christianity influenced it, and most importantly, I've recently made a video dedicated to Vlad III, or Vlad the Impaler. Here's the thumbnail, where we discussed what could have been the inspiration of Bram Stoker's Dracula. So I'm not coming from a complete empty void when it comes to the concept of vampires, but of course if she has a PhD in it, I imagine that she of course knows more about that, and I hope that she's gonna mostly focus on that and not try to present a reinterpretation of the ancient myths for modern audiences, because if that's what happens, then I feel it's just gonna be political talk, which is really a shame, in my opinion, my humble opinion. But let's see.
Today we'll be looking at depictions of vampires in television and film. This scene is from Nosferatu. Nosferatu is kind of plagiarized. They took the story of Dracula from Bram Stoker's novel that was published in 1897 and made a film that's very closely based on that novel with some slight changes. Nosferatu introduced the concept of the vampire who gets destroyed by sunlight. Dracula can go out.
Okay, that's actually a very interesting point. So as you see, I appreciate what she presents. I didn't know that it was Nosferatu that introduced the idea. I knew that Dracula could go out in the light, but I didn't know that it was Nosferatu that introduced that. So already right there, is it really plagiarized? Because I mean, at the end of the day, it's the undead. I mean, the undead are present everywhere, and it's such an ancient tale. Once again, as I say, probably Babylonian in origin, at least as far as the oldest source we have is concerned, which was already talking about sucking blood, but they were drinking blood and feasting on the meat of the dead. But what's interesting is that how can you really plagiarize that? It would be like saying that D&D plagiarized whatever, Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's fantasy. Elves are everywhere. It's not like anyone who speaks about elves and dragons is now plagiarizing Lord of the Rings or D&D. And I think it's fine to use a common denominator to then create your own original story. As in this case, I think Nosferatu did, with the introduction of more of a monstrous type of vampire. Dracula is quite elegant and good looking, at least in the Bram Stoker version, and also the fact that he's reactive to light. But anyways, just my opinion, she's the PhD. Take it with a pinch of salt.
Out during the day, he's fine in the sunshine. There's a scene when the ship, the Demeter, arrives on the shores of Germany, and rats pouring out of the hold of the ship, calling to the idea that when the foreigner comes and arrives into the country, it also brings the plague or contagion. There's a long history of vampires being a metaphor for disease, but also disease was used to kind of explain scientifically what vampire figures might be from. Maybe vampires were actually a figure that represented someone with porphyria, where you can't go outside into sunlight, or
That's an interesting point that she's making. I also think that, to me, disease, sure, but to me, whenever I read the ancient sources, what I notice that I would describe a vampire not necessarily as a representation of disease, but as a representation of a parasite. A vampire is a parasitic organism, however you want to look at it, which to me makes more sense.
Vampires might represent being infected by rabies. And I would not doubt if we get some new vampires coming out of the COVID pandemic to help us understand and grapple with the trauma of global contagion. This
I personally doubt it, but hey, who am I to say?
scene is from Dracula.
It's good to see you back again, Doctor. I heard you have just arrived. And you...
I love it, by the way. I love the oldies.
This is a wonderful scene to demonstrate how handsome, how elegant, how seductive
I agree 100%.
Dracula is supposed to be.
If you appreciate my content so far and wish to help ensure my ability to continue to tell it how it is, regardless of any possible backlash, please support this channel on Patreon. Any support helps me and my team of academics keep the channel strong and gives us the means to fight back against the political rewriting of history. Stand with us, form the wall, defend the truth.
Bela Lugosi's Dracula was a sexy anti-hero. So he had access to the idea that was already rooted in other cultures about vampires not liking mirrors or not being reflected in mirrors. It may be that they have no soul. It may be that they hate to see their own face. And
That's what I was saying. I think this is the concept of vampirism that is possibly influenced by Christianity already. As she says, the idea of not having soul. I don't know how much of that is present in the ancient myths. For what I remember, not much.
The way that it represents the ravages of their life as an undead figure, or even as a diseased human. Another idea is that mirrors used to be backed by silver, and as we know, vampires hate silver. But the idea that Dracula and bats are inextricably linked really comes into the popular imagination with Bela Lugosi's Dracula. This scene
This was interesting. I appreciate that clarification.
is from Dark Shadows.
The stake in the heart. Is it Scottish in origin, that idea?
Why was I in this coffin?
We see Barnabas waking up from his death in a coffin, but he doesn't know that he's a vampire yet. The vampire has always been the villain before. We get a vampire who is the lead. He's the one that we sympathize with and introduces the trope of the vampire as protagonist.
Which then is marvelously continued and represented in Blood Omen Legacy of Kain for PlayStation 1. Professor, if you haven't played that, you've got to play it. I don't know if she's a gamer, though.
He's not excited about being a vampire. He's not reveling in it. He has been cursed with vampirism. This is a really important shift when we go from the cautionary tale to the vampire as someone who we might identify with. This scene is from Sesame Street.
1, too.
The Count is, of course, referring to Count Dracula, but also it's referring to a mythological idea that vampires had to count things if you left them like out in front of your house. People would put grains of rice or beans, hoping to occupy an obsessed vampire who needed to count every grain of rice.
Fascinating. I love these backstories.
Until they could be captured, killed, or burned up by the sun. Vampires can hypnotize. And then it comes all the way through to this child's scene from Sesame Street.
Anything else?
Well, I mean, you know, Bert and Ernie are gay. Queer viewers don't need the confirmation, right? And this is why LGBTQ folks have always gravitated towards the Gothic and...
It's changed completely. Once again, don't misinterpret my words. I have nothing against talking about LGBT, and if I talk about it myself on the channel, although sometimes I present it from a historical standpoint and some people don't like it. But then again, doesn't this feel like we're watching a different video now? Like, what happened? How was this connected? Even the music changed.
Vampires, because these kinds of tropes, they allow for people to do subtextual reading, and because queers have lacked representation, they're really good at finding the subtext. And so we don't always need it to be confirmed that Bert and Ernie are gay lovers, because we've known it since we were 5.
Also, I don't think the 5-year-olds really think about love that way, but that's just me.
The Hunger is a goth subcultural classic. You might think that in 1983, this is the first time that culture was ready to see lesbian seduction. That's not really true. Lesbian vampires have been a staple of the vampire genre from almost the beginning. Before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, Sheridan Le Fanu wrote Carmilla, a vampire coming in, preying on a young, innocent girl. And so
That's the thing, though. What she stated now is a little disingenuous, in my opinion. She said that lesbian vampires have been a thing since almost the very beginning. So whoever listens to that thinks, oh my gosh, this must be an ancient thing, since vampires as a concept has been around from the early stages of civilization that was written down, really. There are a lot of like Akkadian world, Babylonians, ancient Romans, Greeks, classical antiquity. What she meant by that is the beginning of the modern idea of a vampire, because she's in the 1800s. That sounded misleading.
That links up with films like The Hunger, where the vampire seduction, it's a non-normative sexual seduction. There's a homophobic undertone to these vampire stories where the vampire comes to our attention because they are not straight.
So wait, she was just saying, this is what I mean when people see homophobia everywhere. Is it homophobic? Because a second ago you were saying that LGBT people lack representation, which is true. That's true. I think wherever you come from, right wing, left wing, whatever the sort of ideas you have, this is a true statement. With that being said, you just said that they lacked representation, but now that they do have representation, it's homophobic. Is it? Because I mean, yeah, a vampire is an undead. So once again, maybe I'm missing something. So let's see how she defends that statement.
The link between the monster and the queer or the lesbian is tied together.
What have you done to me?
I've given you something you never dared dream of.
What?
Everlasting life.
This scene is from The Lost Boys.
Yes, first.
When it comes to that statement, I think personally that whenever we look at the sort of sexuality that vampires have, because yes, vampires are monsters, absolutely. Now, when we look at the sexuality they have, we see it as lust. Okay, that's how it's represented. It's lust, it's somewhat demonic, it's possessive. Unless you're talking about... Hi.
Hi.
I have a question.
Yes.
What's the name of that show about vampires that you like so much and you want me to watch and I keep refusing?
Twilight.
Thank you. Appreciate. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Okay, so hear me out. When it comes to a show like Twilight, then yes, the love that a vampire is capable of can be very pure and can be very beautiful. But before that, I want to say, in the majority of instances, whenever we talk about the sort of sexual attraction that vampires have, or the sexuality of vampires, it's not a situation that would be a good representation of love is love, if that's what the professor is trying to talk about. But on the other hand, they are deviant in the sense that they are possessive, they're monstrous, they are lustful, and so whatever type of sexuality they have, whether it be straight or whether it be non-straight, it's still represented in a negative way because it's part of the undead and the way that they represent. It's not that they are in love with the other person. And the way I'm going to strengthen this point is the following. You have a lot of stories of vampires that are straight. The seductive masculine vampire that seduces his women as he sucks the blood. It's not like it's against straight people, it's because it's the monster that it's read in a negative connotation and has always been read in a negative connotation. Hence, if your thesis, Professor, was true, and the fact that, these vampires are lesbians, but it's because they're monsters and so it's an homophobic or misogynistic way of reading this, then I would say, no, you're wrong. It's negative because it's always been negative when it comes to vampirism. There is no love or attraction or sensuality that a vampire produces, normally, there are exceptions, Twilight being one, that is not seen as negative. Vampires are monsters, they are undead, and so theirs is a violent form of sensuality, whether it be straight or not. So if it was a case of homosexuality, and you did have a point, then the straight vampire would have been praised. And they are not praised. They are monsters that take women, even though they think they do, but they're being charmed. And so they need to be stopped by the good men, by the good people. I rest my case. Not homophobic.
The Lost Boys is the vampire film for the MTV generation. It's supposed to be a cautionary tale, but it actually does a great job of getting converts to that youth culture. Like, I want to hang out with the vampires in their lair. Michael is tricked into drinking the blood from the bottle, and therefore he becomes infected. But he does not become a full vampire. They all are half vampires. When we have a half vampire, it highlights this idea that one can have conflict within oneself. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they something in between? We see this also in Blade from 1998.
Blade is awesome.
Where he also is a half vampire, but he uses those strengths to actually become a vampire hunter. And so this idea that you could start to show something about yourself and then be cured by science or medicine, it really can represent this idea that society tries to police and control non-normative desires. When
I really think she's reading into it. This sounds a lot like something a modern person, it sounds like modernism to me.
Michael starts down the path towards being a vampire. Does he go forward down the bad path, or does he cure himself of desires that he has started to develop? This scene is from Bram Stoker's Dracula.
You will not by any chance go to sleep in any other part of the castle. Trinchets of deceit.
One thing that is not in the novel is the Count shaving Jonathan, which to me is kind of hot. There is something homoerotic about the shaving scene.
I honestly thought that it was very threatening. I didn't think of homoeroticism. Now that could be me. Maybe I don't see it and it is what they meant, because remember, all that matters when it comes to games, when it comes to films, when it comes to movies, is what the author intended that scene or that character to convey or to be. Whatever you read on top of that, you can read whatever you want, but it doesn't matter if it's not what the author intended. Something like this happens, for example, in Zelda, where there was this whole situation where they kept saying that Link was transgender, and then the author, the Japanese actual author, said no, he's not, and people got pissed. I'm like, it is what it is. But no, that's not what he meant. He literally said it. No, I just wanted to create a character who wasn't too brutish and too masculine, so that both men and women, boy gamers and girl gamers, would be interested and connected to the character. But he's feminine a little bit in the elven sense, He's an elf. He's got pointy ears. But that doesn't mean that he's not transgender and he's not gay. That's what the author said, and those are the last words. And people kept saying, oh, how dare you say that? No, it's his character. He created it. He has the last word. In a similar note, when I look at this scene, once again, it could be me, but I see threat. I see a threat. I don't see homoeroticism. And once again, if the author comes out and responds, leaves a comment, says, hey, I made it. I don't know how. Comes back from the dead. He says, hey, I made it, and I meant it to be exactly homoerotic. She's 100% right. And great. I'll say, okay, fine, you were right. But I don't see that. I see a threatening situation. He's shaving him because it's a blade. If he cuts him, he can drink it, the blood. I think it's a threatening scene. And it's a scene that we see like in mafia movies sometimes. And I can tell you in that case, it's not meaning homoeroticism. It's a threat. It means your life now is in my hands. And in 1 second, I can make a difference between you being alive and you being dead.
Count Dracula sees the crucifix around Jonathan's neck, and he reacts violently. And this is something that is common to many vampires. They react violently to things affiliated with the church. Some scholars think that vampires dislike crucifixes partially because they could potentially be shaped into a stake that could kill them.
I think the reason is, obviously, it's the Christian perspective of the idea that these are demons and therefore they don't like the cross because it's a representation of Christ, God and faith. That's what it means. That's obviously what it means. An interesting side note, however, is the fact that, I don't know if you know this, but you can find out more in my dedicated video to Dracula, to Vlad III, but Vlad III, the sort of historical Dracula, actually called his enemies of the cross, because he was a Christian. Isn't that an interesting plot twist? I thought it was.
Crucifix may be distasteful to vampires because vampires are demons.
Okay, good, she said it. I agree.
Take care how you cut yourself.
This depiction of Dracula is more accurate to the original novel than the 1931 Dracula, though in the original novel he has thick, stout hands with hairs in the center of the palm. It's another way of representing his sexualized perversity. The figure of
I'm sorry, how does that represent sexualized perversity? I don't understand that. I wish she explained it, because unless you do, if you just make a statement like that, Professor, then we as an audience don't understand. Why is having hairs in the center of the palm? I mean, the center of the palm is a very Christian symbol. Regardless of the fact that it might be dedicated to crucifixion the way the Romans did it, it's more probable the crucifixion was done with nails in the wrist rather than here, because if you put a nail here, it's not enough to support the weight of the body. But regardless of that, it is a Christian / very Catholic symbol. So isn't that the way we should read it rather than being something sexual? What's sexual about it? I don't get it.
Count Dracula is inspired by a historical figure. Vlad the Impaler was known as the Impaler because he impaled forests of people around his castle as a warning to those who were coming that he was a harsh and powerful ruler.
Yeah, to the Turks and the Ottoman Turks specifically, these are the people that were coming, his Muslim enemies. But interestingly enough, he was not doing that just as a warning, but he was also doing it as a way to punish the nobles, specifically 200 nobles that had betrayed his father. And also as a warning to the population to not even dare to rebel against him. So 3 reasons as to why he impaled people and left them there for everyone to see. One of which is the one that she said, against the Ottoman Turks, specifically Mehmed II.
Generally, this may be one of the more faithful versions of Count Dracula, besides Nosferatu. I think Nosferatu is probably the most faithful. This scene is from Interview with the Vampire.
Fantastic movie. I love Interview with the Vampire.
And then I said farewell to sunlight and set out to become what I became.
Have you seen?
My favorite scene in this movie is exactly when he turns into a vampire and he looks at the same world. And the world is the same, but it has also changed. And I love how, for example, statues look back now. I love that. It's so subtle, but so deep in the idea of you are not the same being anymore, and therefore your perception of the world changes reality for you. I love that.
Said your goodbyes to the light.
Interview with
Is this homoerotic now?
The vampire is very homoerotic. The gift
Of course it was.
of vampirism is a metaphor for queer sexuality. Lestat gives Louis the gift of death. The French term for an...
Once again, did the author say that? Because I can assure you that the gift of vampirism throughout history hasn't been a metaphor for the gift of homosexuality and queerness. I can assure you that. Unless this is what the author of this specific one meant to say, I think you're reading into it.
The little death. The vampire takes someone to the brink of death, a petit mort, and then brings them back to undeath through the reciprocal exchange of fluids. So it's highly...
Yeah, she's reading a lot into it, and I thoroughly disagree. I think this is just an undead monster, seductive, absolutely, charming if you will, but it is literally feeding. It's feeding off the blood, which is the essence of life in all human beings, and of course is the idea of violence and whatnot, but that is what it is. I don't know why, for this one specifically, Interview for the Vampire would have to become an example of queerness, unless, once again, that's what the author intended.
Sexualized rhetoric, even if it's not explicitly a sex scene. Interview with the Vampire introduced vampire identity, struggling to come to terms with an identity that was thrust upon him. In the 1990s,
even the vocabulary she uses, she's using identity now because she wants to pretty much discuss identity politics. Not a bad word. I'm not saying we can't discuss identity politics. And if someone, even among my viewers, who is struggling with, for example, gender dysphoria, which is absolutely a thing, and it has been, I want to say for as long as humans have existed, even though the way people reacted to gender dysphoria has been different throughout time, for the majority of human time, in fact, as opposed to how people decide to live their lives in their own volition and by their own freedom today, as adults. But the thing is that if someone who is transgender wants to watch the Interview with a Vampire and they want to see it as a mirror of themselves, by all means do it. But I don't think that that's what it was intended to be. I really think you are projecting gender studies onto it. And now you're stating it as, no, that's what it means, PhD, argument from authority, and so we just need to listen to you. Well, I disagree with you, Professor. I think you are projecting a lot of modern politics and identity politics specifically onto a genre and in a mythological creature, including works of fiction that I honestly don't think are all about sex. Not everything is about sex and sexuality.
this was an era of increasing identity politics, coming to political action from the space of who you are.
That's if you had any doubt of my assertment that this was going to be a video about identity politics, political action. She literally said it. I mean, at least I appreciate that she's been masked off. Freedom of speech. She can say whatever she wants. But personally, when I click on a video where a PhD, lecturer, professor, who is an expert on mythology, is going to talk about vampires and examining the movies, and I was hoping for something that didn't include politics. Because if I want to listen to identity politics, to political activism, then I'll Google that on YouTube and I'll watch a video about that. You can watch whatever you want. But in this, I think it feels like a subterfuge. It feels like you are luring me in with something that I'm interested in, and I'm expecting you to speak about the Babylonians, which she never mentioned once. I'm expecting you to talk about the ancient Greeks, not even a mention, the medieval people, how the concept of undead, which I've talked about on this video, by the way, no politics on that one, I can assure you, how the idea of the undead has evolved, like how ghosts are more physical in the medieval period. Like, there is so much that you can say about the origins and interpretation of vampires through the ages that I don't find it here. Like, yeah, there were a couple of interesting things she said, but the majority of this is becoming queer identity, identity politics, political activism, and so I'm feeling a little bit emptied out when it comes to something that I think could have been really good if it just was academic and not political. There, I said it.
The latest series from AMC makes some 21st century adaptations. We have a more explicit treatment of race. This film and the novel take place in the South during a time of racial hierarchies. And it's also not just homoerotic, but they are a queer relationship. That's not unusual for vampire stories. They adapt, they shapeshift. It does speak to the enduring nature of the story that Anne Rice originally created in the 1970s. This scene is from Let the Right One In.
Tja, hej.
Careful with that one, you use the word right.
Du måste bjuda in mig.
Let the Right One In is a heartwarming and touching version of the vampire tale. We get a tender depiction of young love. The characters face evil, but it's not necessarily from vampires. It is from the bullies that they encounter in their daily life. It is from indifferent and abusive parents, a host of things in normative society. So it's a really interesting take on
Normative society? Why do you have to put the word normative? I'm not accusing, I'm not shaming it, I'm not trying to word police, I'm just trying to understand. Why couldn't you say in society? I don't understand why you put normative society. I mean, bad parents exist no matter what, everywhere. And bullying exists everywhere. Not trying to be nitpicky, I'm just trying to understand why she's placing that word in there and what she's trying to convey with it. I'm a linguist. I want to know why she's using specific vocabulary in the way she is.
the way that people can find connection in their outsider status. It also plays more with the question of gender than it does around sexuality.
Får jag chans på dig? Oscar. Jag är ingen flicka.
I think I watched it many years ago. This must be an old one, but I don't think that when she said, and when I'm just trying to keep it real here, when she said I'm not a girl, I don't think she means I identify as a boy. I think she means I'm not a human being. She's what she is. That's what that sentence meant, for what I remember.
Får jag chans på dig eller?
Oscar just wants to be together. And so there's something that transcends gender and sexuality in that moment, that their human and vampire connection is the most important thing. Eli does not conform to binary gender. Eli is not human. The status of a vampire as non-human doesn't make them dehumanized and therefore in need of destruction. It gives them access to a bigger range of experience. There's a shift that goes on in this movie that I find really touching. This scene is
Oh my gosh, like literally, she sees gender identity everywhere. I'm starting to think that if you watch a movie about a medieval siege of Christian crusaders, she's gonna say, well, but the crusaders are using swords to stab their opponent, and that is a representation of sexuality because the sword is penetrating the other person's abdomen, and the abdomen is where a woman creates life that's what she's gonna do. And anyone can do that. Like, you don't even need to be a gender study professional to do that. Because I just did it. Like, I could look at this. This is Street Fighter, Ken, and notice how he's a man, right? Because he's got a male body, but then again, his long hair and blonde represents the fact that he's not gender conforming and is not, but the fact that he's wearing red may make you think that he's a Trump supporter, but in reality, you can change color, which means it's the innate nature of changing and representing who you identify. If you don't identify as a MAGA supporter, you can always dress in blue. I mean, that's what she's doing. Oh, for crying out loud.
is from Twilight.
You're impossibly fat
Oh, my wife is gonna love this.
and strong. You never eat or drink anything.
That's not accurate. He does drink.
I know what you are. Vampire.
Twilight is an interesting phenomenon. He's not cast as a seductive outsider that we should avoid, but he and his family represent what we should aspire to. They have wealth, they have cars, perfect beauty, they have strength, and maybe most importantly, they have restraint because they are vegetarian vampires. And
I've never watched it. I mean, my wife is trying. I think eventually I'll have to just to make her happy, but vegetarian vampires?
this struck a chord. They became such a cultural phenomenon.
I need to call her.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey.
So talking about Twilight,
Oh
is,
God.
is it true that they are vegetarian vampires?
Well, yeah, in the sense they don't feed from humans.
Ah, okay, cool.
They feed from
Okay,
animals.
fact check. Fact checked. Appreciate.
Happy to help.
Thank you. Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao.
The Twilight vampires align with a lot of the depictions that we've seen throughout the centuries. In other ways,
which you never mentioned, and I really wish you know what, I'm gonna make a video myself. I'm gonna make the video that this should have been, and I'm gonna talk about all the different ideas and versions of vampires and how they evolve through different cultures and throughout the millennia. That's what I was hoping that this would have been.
They diverge. When we get to Twilight, vampires technically can go out in the sun. It doesn't weaken them, but it does expose them for their true nature. They pull Bela Lugosi's class and wealth together with...
No, sorry, the old one is more classy.
The Lost Boys, flashy youth culture, and create this new monster that everybody wants to either be or be with. They are the pinnacle of 21st century capitalist aspirations. This scene is from What We Do in the Shadows, a satire of the vampire genre. Colin Robinson, he breaks all of the vampire tropes that we're used to seeing, except that he feeds on people's energy. This is something that occurs very frequently in relation to vampires. That's one reason why tuberculosis was associated with vampires. Tuberculosis was called consumption because it was like you were being drained or consumed slowly over time, wasting away. The vampires in the household are anachronistic. They're out of step with time. And this is a knowing, like tongue-in-cheek callback to the idea that vampires are primitive. Count Dracula is coming from a town where everyone is uncivilized and superstitious. The show knows that it is satirizing the racist and imperialist implications of vampires as out of step with time.
I don't see any racist or colonialist position in that at all.
Doesn't make you glamorous. It makes you out of touch, like a dad times 1,000.
I don't know what I'm capable of.
The unintended and sometimes terrifying consequences of technology. You're trying to solve something and not recognizing what might happen as a result. And that's really a present cultural anxiety, especially around climate change and perhaps the fantasy that it changes someone.
No, literally, okay, listen, I'm gonna have to call it a day because I'm already kind of tired of this. She literally is presenting every possible political, modern American political talking point into this discussion of vampires. Next, she's going to talk about January 6th. She's going to talk about immigration. She's going to talk about who to vote for. Literally, that's what this is. And I personally don't like it. And I wouldn't have liked it if she was constantly pushing right-wing positions all the same. You can not believe that, but then again, I've proven multiple times that I get attacked by both sides and I get called one day I'm meta-woke and the other day I'm a right-wing grifter, which means I'm neither. So at the end of the day, anyways, I think I'm just going to call it a day. But yeah, a little disappointed, unfortunately. I was hoping a lot more academic neutrality from an academic, and I was hoping that she wouldn't waste this opportunity to just push politics. And at the end of the day, this is something that we've seen happen a lot on Vanity Fair already, and I've already dedicated 2 videos that you can see here if you want to check that out. And of course, for anyone who says, Metatron, but why are you focusing on 2 professors that are pushing what left-wing positions? Why don't you attack professors that put right-wing positions? Please find them. If a professor talks about something that it's history, mythology, ancient, whatever, and instead they use that as an opportunity to push whatever it is that their agenda is politically, absolutely I'll debunk them if what they are saying is incorrect, or if it seems that they are taking this opportunity to be a little bit disingenuous about what the sort of information they were actually trying to present and the full sort of message that they're trying to present. If she had been more honest about it and they said, here is a professor who's going to tell the audience about her opinions on gender studies and politics, then great, I would have known, I wouldn't have clicked, because I'm bored by politics. I find it boring. I'm interested in the ancient period. I want to hear about mythology and history. And she unfortunately didn't deliver. Anyways, let me know what you think. If I got something wrong, please change my mind. I'm always happy to do that. And I will be looking forward to your comments. And thank you very much for watching. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.